So we are going to begin with Unit 3 today, and it's English Canadian Theatre and Drama. We will be talking about its evolution in a very detailed explanation. I will be able to guide you on the Unit 3 part. Now, in this unit, we will be exploring the history and development of English Canadian theatre and drama. And mostly, in order to understand the entire part, we need to understand that it is divided into three key phases. Number one is colonial period, where theatre was heavily influenced by the European traditions. Number two, emergence of a Canadian theoretical identity, where the efforts to create uniquely Canadian plays. And number three, professional Canadian theatre, where the rise of modern independent Canadian theatre in the 20th century happened. Now, although Canada had theatrical activity since early colonial times, professional Canadian drama only emerged after 1950s. So right now we will be discussing about the colonialism and theatre in Canada. We will start with the pre-European indigenous theatre. Before the arrival of Europeans, indigenous cultures in Canada had their own forms of dramatic performance that served spiritual, social, and educational purposes. These performances included role of shamans and mystics. These are the indigenous shamans and mystics who acted as storytellers and performers, conducting rituals, spiritual plays, and dances. These performances involved masks, elaborate costumes, props, ventriloquism, and exaggerated vocal effects to communicate with spirits and ancestors. The themes of indigenous drama mostly typically revolved around the themes of initiation, purification, death, and resurrection. They also sought to influence nature elements such as bringing rain or curing illnesses. And it was involved in the indigenous performances. Audience members sang songs, chanted, and delivered scripted lines, making the event an interactive, very interactive experience. The mystery play of the Kawakatul Indians. This is one of the most famous indigenous theatrical tradition, which was the Kwakiutl mystery play from British Columbia. Similar to European mystery cycle plays, the drama focused on mythology, spiritual events, and the supernatural. Early European theatre in Canada, when Europeans arrived, they brought their own theatrical traditions. Documented European play performed in North America was Le Théâtre de Napoléon. It was in 1609, which was written by Marc Lescarbot, a French lawyer and writer, and performed in Port Royal, present day Nova Scotia. It was a verse drama featuring French settlers and Mi'kmaq indigenous people. The play symbolized French dominance and colonial expansion while also incorporating indigenous participation. British theoretical influences, military officers introduced London plays to Canada. In 1792, the officers of the colonial garrison of Sheridan's The School for Scandal, a popular British comedy. Then the attempt to Canadianize theatre. Now, this happened. Then came the attempt to organize theatre. Now, this happened in the 19th century. Some Canadian writers began plays with uniquely Canadian themes rather than just performing British imports. There were Charles Meyer Tecume, that was written in 1886, a member of the Canada First Movement, which aimed to promote a distinctly Canadian identity. Play Tecumseh focused on indigenous resistance against colonial forces. But it was not successful because it was considered too difficult to perform on stage. Henry Fuller, HMS Parliament, 1880. This political satire criticized Prime Minister Sir John A. Macdonald national policy, which promoted economic nationalism by restricting free trade with the US. The play humorously portrayed Canada's relationship with Britain and the US using allegorical characters such as Britannia, which was representing Britain, Canada, which was personifying Canada, and cousin Jonathan, which was symbolizing the US. Some of the examples from the play Britannia. I am told you are carrying a flirtation with your cousin Jonathan, and some people are talking about an alliance between Canada. It is a horrid sorry, Mama. I like Jonathan very much and a cousin, but I should never dream of a close connection. This dialogue reflected Canada's reluctance to fully align with the US while maintaining close ties with Britain. In Canadian theatrical identity, there were a lot of challenges in establishing Canadian drama. First, British and American domination. In the early 20th century, Canadian theatre lacked independence and was highly influenced by British and American productions. Canadian actors and playwrights New York or London to gain recognition. B.K. Sandwell's criticism, which was very famous in 1911, it was Sandwell critic for the Canadian magazine who pointed out that Canadian actors could only succeed in foreign cities. Canadian theatres were controlled by foreign investors. Toronto and Montreal relied on Broadway productions rather than developing their own theatre culture. There was also an influence from British and the American. Harold Terry's perspective, Terry, a British playwright, saw America playing as a threat to British influence in Canada. He believed that Canada should remain culturally tied to Britain. Rise of local theatres movement, impact of radio, the rise of radio and cinema reduced the profitability of touring British and American theatre companies leaving from Canada's theatre groups. The Little Theatre movement in Canada, inspired by the European experimental theatre, the Canadian theatre group rejected commercialism and focused on innovation. The arts theatres players of Toronto became pioneers in this movement. The found of Hart House Theatre in 1919, which was played as a major role in training Canadian actors, directors, and playwrights. However, professional theatre did not fully emerge in Canada until after the 1950s. The rise of professional Canadian theatre happened only between 1949 to 1951, especially from the role of the Massey Commission, where government involved in the arts. Prime Minister Louis St. Laurent established the Massey Commission to promote Canadian arts, literature, and theatre. The Massey Report 1951 led to the formation of Canada Council for the Arts, which provided government funding for Canadian playwrights and theatre companies. Impact of Canada's centennial celebrations in 1967 increased funding for Canadian theatre. The government built new theatres and provided funding for Canadian playwrights, rediscovery of Canadian identity. The centennial celebrations allowed Canadians to see their own stories on stage. Then came the ecstasy of Piaggio in 1967, where Canada's first professional play, George Riga's Influence, happened. The play criticized Canada's treatment of Indigenous people. It is used as experimental technique such as rock music, dance, and film projections. Then the role of docudrama, James Rennie's The Donnellys, the historical drama based on life crime story blended history, folklore, music, and dance to create a unique and Canadian form of theatre. In mostly, we were all changed by that vision. It was a glimpse of subconscious Canada art, the excitement, energy, and creativity that lay beneath the proverbial bland exterior and preview of the cultural and artistic event that was to follow. For some, the renewed sense of nationality was exhilarating, for others, it was frightening. SM Green, The Invisible Country, in Don Rubin, Canadian Theatre History, Selected Readings, Cobb Clark Limited, Toronto 1966, in page number 332. During national celebrations, many buildings of theatres were built from the federal funds from Canada Council of Art and subsidies were given to Canadian production. The first proficient drama is Ecstasy of Rita Jo by George Riga. To mention, I would prefer to date the emergence of the Canadian playwright from the appearance on November 23, 1967 of George Riga's The Ecstasy of Rita Jo at the Vancouver Playhouse was Riga's rather wry senatorial gift to the people. This play anatomized Canada's treatment of the minorities, in this case native. Here Riga dramatized the tale of a cementos, that is a man who has lost his soul, a man who has lost touch with earth. Riga invented a new dramaturgy in which he could give theatrical shape and definition of stream of consciousness techniques that were traditional, the traditional used by the novelist and the poet. It is, however, not a memory play. It is a sustained montage divorced from casuality and a regular time sequence. He uses rock music, dance, and film projections to comment on the conflict between a bourgeois society and the new alternative culture of the 1960s, Bananas and Wild Strawberries, produced by Vancouver Playhouse in 1969. Another noteworthy playwright who wrote docudrama to Canadian theatre, James Rennie, his trilogies of play, collectively known as Donnelly's. A while ago, I was describing that. This docudrama is claimed to be a very Canadian story visiting history. A real incident reported in Vancouver newspapers is replayed in 8 hours in this trilogy, which combines history, folktale, myth, music, dancing, mime, and a host of ingenious liturgical techniques and devices. Canadian drama, after the arrival of James Rennie, has acquired a new meaning. Now, if we are to summing up the entire unit, we would try to understand that Canadian theatre developed slowly due to the colonial influences. During 1967, it was a leading to increased funding and artistic independence. Canadian theatre gained international recognition through works like The Ecstasy of Rita Jo and The Dolenies. So, when we talk about Unit 3 and we come to know that there had been so much of flourishing in the technology and whatever could shape the Canadian form of literature or thought or its cultural identity. So we take a break of 5 minutes and exactly at 4:12 we begin with the unit 4. Unit 4 would be discussing about the Canadian discourse on nature and technology that we just summed up. Studying in details the
Good
unit.
afternoon, ma'am.
Good afternoon. Yeah, so we begin with unit 4 in the next 4 minutes. Please take a break. So let's begin with Unit 4. In Unit 4, we are studying about the Canadian discourse on nature and technology, and I'll be trying to provide you with a detailed explanation. In this unit, we explore how nature and technology shape Canadian thought, literature, and cultural identity. The Canadian landscape has historically influenced the country's mindset, lifestyle, and artistic expression. Technology, on the other hand, has played a very crucial role in the Canada's economic development, social structures, and cultural evolution. The unit in this case has been divided into three major sections. We'll study about the lifestyle and mindset. We will discuss about how Canadians relate to nature and technology. We then discuss about the note of terror. We discuss about how the vast and harsh Canadian landscape has influenced the national psyche. Then we talk about the recourse to myth. We discuss about how Canadian literature and philosophy reflect the ongoing struggle between nature, civilization, and technology. Under lifestyle and mindset, we also discuss about the urbanization and the Canadian identity, which is a very important aspect. Despite its vast wilderness, we know that Canada is an urbanized nation. There are over 75% of Canadians' lives in cities, making them more urbanized than the Americans. The major metropolitan areas that include under this urbanization are Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal, each housing populations of over a million. However, the historical memory of the wilderness remains deeply embedded in Canadian consciousness. The landscape of forests, lakes, mountains, and prairies continue to define how Canadians perceive their past, even though modern life is primarily urban. If we talk about the wilderness as a symbol, we know that the early Europeans settlers viewed the Canadian wilderness as a hostile force that had to be conquered. Over time, however, it became a symbol of nostalgia and adventure. Many Canadians today romanticize the life of early explorers, imagining themselves in a log cabin deep in the northern wilderness. This sentiment reflects a duality in the Canadian identity: urban modernity that embraces technology and economic progress, and again, there is a deep emotional connection to nature rooted in the history. Here, nature plays an advisory in early Canadian literature. The wilderness was often portrayed as a terrifying, uncontrollable force in early Canadian literature. John Richardson, who fought in the War of 1812, wrote Wacosta, or The Prophecy's Tale of the Canadas, in 1832. This historical romance set in 1763 describes the final upsprings of indigenous groups against the British. Richardson presents the forest as a psychological space of terror. In Wacosta, civilization is symbolized by the fort, a small outpost of British order surrounded by an alien, menacing wilderness. The novel contrasts two characters: Wacosta, which represents nature and instinct, embodying the wild, untamed aspect of humanity, and the Colonel D. Hardimer, who represents civilization, embodying order, discipline, and imperial control. At the novel's conclusion, both characters are killed, symbolizing that neither extreme, pure nature nor pure civilization can truly triumph. Instead, the idealized Englishman, that is Hardimer's son, is left to forge a balance between the two. Richardson's message is clear: nature must be controlled and civilized for progress to occur. This idea remains central to the Canadian mindset for such towards the 19th century and the early 20th century. However, there was a note of terror. We talked about North Through Fire and the Canadian landscape in the last units. Canadian literary critic North Through Fire argued that terror is a central theme in the Canadian literature. He suggested that early settlers felt a deep fear of the wilderness, which was vast, empty, and seemingly infinite. Unlike the United States, where settlers found a well defined coastline that was familiar and welcoming, Canada's interior was unknown and uncharted. Early European immigrants, when arriving in Hudson Bay or the Gulf of St. Lawrence, felt an overwhelming sense of isolation and helplessness. That it also created a psychological impact of nature on the early settlers. There was a lot of loneliness and isolation since the extreme geographical distances between settlements made life incredibly lonely. Winters were harsh and long, making survival difficult. There was a lot of cultural shock too found in this element. British and European settlers were used to structured environments. Here, coming to a vast, untamed Canadian land created a sense of disorientation and loss of control. Roughing It in the Bush, written in 1852 by Susanna Moody. Moody's memoirs describe her experience as an immigrant in Canada. She writes about aching loneliness, cultural shock, and the struggle to impose human order on nature. Her work captures the psychological trauma faced by early settlers, reinforcing Fire's argument about the theme of terror in Canadian literature. Then comes From Fear to Nostalgia. Over a period of time, as technology and infrastructure developed, Canadians moved from fearing nature to longing for it. In the modern era, wilderness is no longer a threat, but rather a symbol of purity, escape, and lost innocence. One of the most fascinating figures in this shift was Archibald Bellamy, who also known as Grey Owl. The case of Grey Owl was an Englishman who came to Canada at the age of 18. Within 2 years, he reinvented himself as an indigenous man. He rejected his British identity and lived as a self proclaimed half breed. He adopted indigenous customs, wearing traditional clothing, and speaking about conversations. His book, Pilgrims of the Wild in 1935, became a sensation in Britain and Canada, prevailing nostalgia for the lost wilderness. Although Gray's owl true identity was exposed after his death, his influence remains strong. His work helped shift the Canadian imagination from fearing the wilderness to embracing it as a part of their cultural heritage. Moving ahead, the records to myth. Margaret Atwood surfacing is one of the important study that we will be covering at the some on the next coming times. Written in 1972 and the Return to Nature. Modern Canadian literature continues to explore the conflict between civilization and nature. In Surfacing, Atwood's protagonist embarks on a journey into the northern wilderness, which becomes a symbolic return to a primal state. During his journey, she questions the values of Western civilization, rejects technological dominance over nature, seeks to integrate herself into the natural world. Atwood challenges the traditional Western view that nature must be controlled. Instead, she argues that humans should coexist with nature without trying to dominate it. The three views of nature in Western thought includes nature as a resource, wilderness exists to be exploited for human benefit. Nature as a romantic ideal, wilderness is seen as a source of beauty and spiritual renewal. Nature as an independent force. Atwood introduces a third view that is, humans do not own or control nature, they are simply a part of it. Artwood vision contrasts with the technological domination of nature, which has been a central concern of Canadian philosophy. As and how we move ahead, we come to understand that the Canadian mind between nature and technology is always creating some of the ambivalence towards technology. Canadian intellectuals like Marshall McLuhan, Harold Ennis, George Grant have explored the effects of technology on Canadian society. McLuhan's The Medium is a Message argues that technology fundamentally changes human perception. Innis studies technological control over information, suggesting that media shapes power structures. Grant critiques technological dependency, warning that Canada is losing its unique identity to American technological dominance. Final thoughts if we come to talk about this part, we come to know that the Canadian mindset is torn between nostalgia for the wilderness and reliance on technology. While early settlers feared the land, modern Canadians now long for its lost purity. At the same time, technology has transformed Canada into an urban industrial nation, raising questions about cultural potence, environmental responsibility, and national identity. Now, if we delve deep into all of these aspects, we will want to understand that we need to expand our analysis towards these areas where we study the relationship of Canada with nature and technology, how it focuses on fear, how it focuses on nostalgia, what is modernization, be how is modernization a part of it, and how all of them have shaped the national mindset, literature, and cultural identity. Whether European settlers first arrived in Canada and how they encountered the land vastly, which was completely different from Europe, and whether you take nature to be becoming a symbol of fear or terror, a symbol of fear or terror, or whether it was Northrop Fryer's Garrison mentality, the book, where he has critiqued about the psychological impact of this fear, where settlers saw themselves as small, fragile outposts of civilization surrounded by a vast, uncontrollable landscape, where they could build forts, towns, and farms, but with an attempt to impose order on the wild land. Now, whether or not the key aspects of this unit talked about the role of nature and technology in connection with the discourse formation in Canada, we need to understand it through few more examples, especially the lines from Artwood surfacing. I lean against tree. I am a tree leaning. I'm not an animal or a tree. I am the thing in which the trees and animals move and grow. I am a place. The two modes of population of nature here in the Western thinking are that the wilderness serves us as a raw material for our technologies. For our technologies. Like Wordsworth and others, it must approve or disapprove. Art would suggest there is a third mode too. Nature is our place. We are in it. A world in which man does not dominate his environment, either projecting his will on it or reading mystical messages, waiting for intimations of immorality. He accepts nature as the fact of itself, a demystified and a desecularized version of perceiving nature. Man belongs to nature, as do the skies, sunshine, the trees. He takes part in a symbiotic relationship, seeking no superior place, rather recognizing nature's power to overwhelm him. Atwood sends her heroine back to her anesthetized urban and environment where nature is paved over. This dialect of nature and civilization, which is the basic theme of Atwood's surfacing, form the core of the Canadian discourse on technology. This highly original, comprehensive, and eloquent discourse on technology is Canada's principal contribution to North American through. This discourse is situated midway between the future of the New World and the past of the European culture. The Canadian mind is that of the in between, which oscillates between the pragmatic will to live at all costs of the Americans' searing lament for that which has been suppressed by the modern technological order. The Canadian intellectual condition, where Croker argues, is to be ambivalent to the present mindedness of American culture on the one hand and the cultural legacy of the European past on the other. By virtue of historical circumstances and geographical accident, the technological American empire has marginalized the Canadian existence. The Canadian intellectual condition of ambivalence is thus a product of the dialectical movement between the power of the American empire and the bitter historical knowledge that the crisis has its origin much deeper in European culture. The Canadian mind may thus be one of the main sites in modern times for working out the meaning of the technological experience. The Canadian thinkers who have deliberated on this issue are those writers and critics who examine technological humanism and brings them all together by presenting a comprehensive view of the dialectics between technology and society. There is a reflection on the price to be paid for the consumer purpose and the technological society, and on sociology studies the deep relationship between technology and dependency in Canadian economic history. There is an understanding that technologies of communication in the electronic age overthrow the privileged position of the contents of the media, substituting a new sign language of rhetorical and symbolical effect. This is the age of the enclosure of whole societies within designed environments of media. There is a thesis that all media work us over completely. They're so persuasive in their personal, political, economic, aesthetic, psychological, moral, ethical, and social consequences that they leave no part of us untouched, unaffected, unaltered. The medium is the message. Any understanding of society and cultural change is impossible without a knowledge of the way media work as environments. There has been a complete processed world today. As we enter the electronic age with its instantaneous and global movement of information, we are the first human beings to believe completely within the mediated environment of the technostructure. It is our plight to be processed through the technological simulacrum, to participate intensively and integrally in a technostructure which is nothing but a vast simulation and amplification of the bodily senses. This technological simulacrum from Harold Innis is a process of making the mark of technology both transforms and screens off the environment and prisons us within the seductive vision of the technological imagination. He studies technological experience as a dynamic social process with which we are implicated as historical beings. The delicate process of healing from the technological simulacrum will have to be at two levels. First, as the damaged human sensibility, and then a damaged natural environment as a methodological but also a rural practice. Innes insists that it is only by reliving in depth the actual history of industrial technology in economy, politics, psychology, and culture that we can achieve a thorough understanding of the political economy of modern technology or the relationship between technology and civilization in North America. Now, to sum this all up, we have to understand that the concepts of technological dependency, of grant, or of technological humanism, whether of McLuhan and of technological realism of Innes, seem to emphasize collectively that technology is the real world. It is distinctive modern facts to live technology as a kind of second biology which defines and limits the human condition. To define ourselves in this new technological environment, then it is to establish a new relationship with ourselves and with nature, which informs the comprehensive and eloquent Canadian discourse on nature and technology. Now, if we try to understand what exactly we're trying to understand the lifestyle and the mindset of such people who have been somewhere in between the connection of nature and technology, we need to look at the map of Canada. We find it colorful, and we find there are beautiful dramatic patterns of lakes and forest and mountains and other things which has absolute discourse with nature. More so, we also know that very few people live on such a huge landmass which is bigger in size than Russia or USA or Brazil. Most of other countries in the world even do not belong to such kind of nature to discourse with. An interesting fact of today's life in Canada, however, is that 75% of its population lives in cities. As of 1986, Canada had only 28 metropolitan areas with population of 10,000, and together these cities accounted for exactly 61% of Canada's total population of 25 million people. Canadians thus are an urban people. They are more urban than their neighbors in the south, as more than 1 in 4 Canadians live in metropolitan areas with population of over a million, while in contrast only 1 in 12 live in a similar urban agglomerations in the United States. Canada has thus molded a cold northern landscape of yesterday, with which Suzanne Moody and others fought to civilize it, into a dozen of modern, efficient, and healthy cities. For example, Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, who have an advanced and a high state, are the citizens of few countries in the world could claim to have developed urban environments that are so orderly and healthy, so vibrant and safe. The history of development of the urban environment in Canada is the history of development of the urban discourse on nature and technology. We need to understand the experience of wrestling with a rigorous northern climate and wilderness conditions have shaped the Canadian imagination. Since the time of the early settlers, the idea of the forest therefore has struck in the Canadian mind so that it has become a symbol. One of the most nostalgic pastimes of a Canadian tourist is to stay in a long cabin in the northern wilderness. This is a dream of the original explorer. If we look at the Canadian literature, we see it as an ongoing dialogue with the wilderness, an obsessive, repetitive effort to relieve that moment of original encounter that the settlers had with nature. Major John Richardson, who fought with the British Army against the Americans in the War of 1812, wrote a number of wilderness novels, especially in 1832, that talked about the Gothic extravaganza, the historical romance set in 1763, which describes the last Indian uprising led by the famous chief Pontis against the British forts. The two forts Richardson describes are outposts of civilization, lost in terrifying and alien wilderness, desperately fending the rituals of British color. The more powerful agent in this novel is the forest, a psychological space that is unmitigating, terrifying. Here, nature is in total opposition to culture and holds no possibility except nightmare. Happiness, liberty, and civilization itself is pressed nostalgically within the safe walls of the fort, which is surrounded by a huge, unthinking, menacing, and the formidable wilderness. A personal motive of revenge requires a symbolic and paradigm, two aspects of white man at war. On the one hand, it is a superego, which is authoritarian, repressive, militaristic, and committed to an ideal of terror. On the other hand, it is unconscious, passionate, mind rising in nightmare violence against all the constraint to it. The novel's Gothicism thus easily turns the forest into a dream landscape. In the symbolic allegory, Richardson makes Vacosta a child of nature and Colonel de Hadimar a product of civilization and its corruption. At the end of the novel, Richardson makes an ironic compromise by killing both Vacosta and Colonel de Hadimar, and Hadimir's son is idealized as an Englishman who carries on the burden of the imperial mission and makes peace with the Indians. Richardson thus sees nature as alien territory that must be dominated, just as man's passion self must be constrained. Until it is civilized, the wilderness is an enemy who has to be conquered. That is the message of the book. Now we have discussed about both the units and some of the important questions which can come up in the previous unit is um, the previous unit that described the English Canadian theatre and drama, and we also discussed about the evolution part of it. We discussed about the Canadian drama and theater part of it. So important questions which can come up here is what makes 1967 a key year in the development of Indigenous Canadian drama. This can be from Unit 3. And what gives George Raiga a special place in Canadian drama? Now, if you would want to and discuss especially these two questions, I'll repeat this question. What makes, just a second. Yes. The question, what makes 1967 a key year in the development of Indigenous Canadian drama? And here, if we focus, we'll majorly talk about the 1967 year, which is actually a turning point in the Canadian drama, which especially for Indigenous representation on stage. And due to, again, very several important aspects you can point out. And one of them was Canada's centennial celebrations and increased support for the arts. And now this year marked the 100th anniversary of the Canadian Confederation, leading to major investments in the Canadian culture and theatre. The Canadian government, through institutions like the Canadian Council for the Arts, funded new theatrical productions that focused on Canadian stories, including the Indigenous narratives. There was a shift which was encouraged from theatre companies to move away from European and American influences, allowing the Canadian playwrights to explore themes of Indigenous identity, colonization, and social justice. And you can give examples of the emergence of the ecstasy of Rita Joe, which was a groundbreaking Indigenous drama. We will be studying about it in details in the upcoming units and blogs. Here, George Raiga is the first happened in Vancouver Playhouse in 1967, and it was one of the first Canadian plays to center around indigenous experiences and deals with the struggles of Indigenous people in urban Canada. The play highlighted the systematic racism, poverty, and cultural alienation faced by the Indigenous communities, marking a major departure from traditional Canadian theatre. Also, it is raw, it is emotionally fulfilling, it is emotionally storytelling, and the experimental theoretical techniques, which also set a new standard for the Indigenous drama. It inspired later playwrights such as Thompson Highway, and Drew Hayden Taylor. And then there was a beginning of the political and social awareness in the Canadian theatre, which coincided with the rise of the Indigenous rights movement in Canada. And again, the play again proved a major role in raising public awareness about Indigenous issues. The play challenged stereotypes, making it clear that Indigenous voices need to be heard in the Canadian theatre. Hence, 1967 can be considered as the birth of Indigenous Canadian drama, where it marked the beginning of the Indigenous centered narratives and the inclusion of Indigenous issues in mainstream Canadian theatre. This is one of the important questions which you need to understand. And the next question was, what gives George Raiga a special place in the Canadian drama? George Raiga holds a special place in Canadian drama because of his groundbreaking contribution to the development of socially conscious Canadian theatre, particularly in representing the marginalized communities. He was one of the first playwrights to focus on the Indigenous struggles. Before Raiga, there were more Canadian theatre also, but who ignored Indigenous issues. But Raiga, through his play, could portray the real struggles of the Indigenous people in an urban setting. The play also challenged the traditional portrayal of Indigenous people, where there were novel savages or tragic figures, instead of presenting them as a complex, fully developed characters. Now, he introduced a bold experimental theoretical style. Riga broke away from the linear storytelling by using flashbacks, poetic monologues, and dream sequences. He combined realism with symbolic and expressionist elements, allowing audiences to experience the psychological struggles of his character. Now, a lot of things can be mentioned about George Riga here. Now, let's talk about Unit 4. Two important questions which you should be discussing is, what is the role of terror in the Canadian mindset, and what is general Canadian outlook of nature, especially in the early years of his existence in the nation. So, again, uh, you need to understand that in Unit 4, we talked about the Canadian mindset, where terror has a central theme in the Canadian literature and cultural identity, which largely stems from the vast, harsh, and unforgiving nature of the Canadian landscape. Now, this theme is deeply embedded in the collective psyche of early settlers, explorers, and even modern Canadians. Here we need to talk about the Northrop Fire, and his theory was stark terror in Canadian literature. Now, he used this theory in dominated sense, where he talked about the fear of isolation, nature, and the unknown. Unlike in the European literature, there had been nature, where is often seen as a garden of paradise. Canadian literature frequently portrays nature as a vast, empty, and a dangerous force. So, the experiences of the early settlers, we can mention, like unlike in the US, where the coastline was familiar and welcoming, Canada's landscape was alien, cold, and endless. Also, settlers often lived in complete isolation, cut off from the neighbor's town or for months at a time, leading to deep psychological distress and fear of the wilderness. Winter is particularly a terrifier because it symbolizes death and helplessness. And these are the examples which you can find, for example, the Roughing It in the Bush in 1852, and Wacosta in 1832, and again in Survival, Margaret Atwood in Survival 1972. Now, this transformed, but over a period of time, where in 19th century, nature was viewed something to be conquered and controlled. And by 20th century, Canada no longer feared nature in the same way, but instead began to romanticize it. Now, the general Canadian attitude also evolved over a period of time, and then there was a look upon to the technology. There was a look upon to the communication technology in the Canadian thought, and these are all could find from the books like from the Canadian thinkers like Marshall McLuhan, especially the medium in the message, the Harold Innis, and the Empire of the Communication. Now, these were all the groundbreaking technological identity, where Canadians recognized the importance of technology but remained wary of its social and cultural consequences. And the mindset also is one of the ambivalence, constantly weighing the benefits of technology against the risk of losing cultural and environmental heritage. So we are done with block one. We finished block one today. We completed 4 units from block one. Tomorrow we study block two, and in block two we study about the recent Canadian poetry. It has also 4 units. So tomorrow we will be focusing on unit five, where we talk about the growth of Canadian poetry, and in unit six um, we study about the Commonwealth poetry and Canada's place in it. So, with this, we end with the second day of the sessions, and yeah, see you tomorrow. Thank you so much.